This video is the fourth and final video of a small series where we create a full stack mean application. So far we've created our Angular single page application and we have a backend service of Node.js and Express.js. Now we're going to look at how we can introduce MongoDB for persisting our data. So in this video we're now going to be able to persist our data, we're going to be able to get it, update it, and also delete it. To begin creating our database, we need to sign up to MongoDB online. So head to mongodb.com where we have the option to try for free at the top right. And this is a free cloud solution that offers us a sandbox of basic features that allow us to test our application. So if you follow the sign up form and the instructions to create an Atlas account, I'll meet you at the next page. So the page that we will be taken to when you sign in will contain our databases with MongoDB. We can build a new cluster within our project, so select Build a Database, then select the free tier options, so I will use AWS in the EU West 1 region, and then at the bottom you can just hit Create Cluster. So clusters host the MongoDB database. These can be horizontally scaled by adding more resources if required, thus the name of cluster. And a cluster consists of a collection of datasets distributed across different servers, and this provides a better read and write performance for us. So the Quick Start menu offers us the option to create a profile for the cluster, and this is what we can authenticate into our cluster with. So I'll just create a username called Aneesh, and the password will be building a mean application. You can use whichever password you like. I just use this one because it'll be easier to reference when we need to in our code. And then you can just hit create user. We can now use these details to authenticate into our database. So let's just make sure that we save them for later. So as well as creating a user that can authenticate and use our database, we also want to specify which IP addresses can make requests to that database. So for this, we will need to register our IP address into the IP whitelist, then just hit finish and close at the bottom. And also make a note that the current IP address that we're using can change. So in the future, if let's say you're accessing your application on different days, you might face connectivity issues, and it might be due to the IP addresses that you have registered as able to access your database. So that's just something to note. So we're able to connect our Node application to the MongoDB database by using a third-party package that provides us with out-of-the-box support, and this is called Mongoose. We can install Mongoose into our backend server with npm install --save mongoose. And Mongoose uses schemas to define how our data should look like in a structured way. So this makes it really easy for us to access our MongoDB database with a schema. This way our application knows what the data should be looking like when it goes to access it within MongoDB. So to define a schema, which is how our data will look, I'll create a new file called entry-schema.js, and within this I will first import Mongoose into a constant with the require keyword, and we can now create a schema, which again is the blueprint for how our data should be looking in the database. So I will define a new constant called entry-schema and call the schema method on our Mongoose module. And this method will accept a JSON representation of our data. So I will supply a date and an entry, both of type string, and remember to use capital S for string, as this is not written in TypeScript. We're writing it in JavaScript instead. So I haven't actually included the ID yet. That's because the ID is auto-generated, and we'll see a little bit more detail on how an ID is created and what it means to us in our application just a little bit further in this video. So the next part is defining a model with Mongoose, and a model is going to be used to create items based upon the schema that we have just defined. So we do this with mongoose.model, and within this method we will pass in two arguments. First will be the name of the model, so I'm just going to put diary entry, and the schema that we want to use will be the second argument, so we'll just pass in entry schema. And then lastly, we're going to export this model by doing module.exports equals just before at the start of this line. So we can use our entry model within the Express middleware to persist our data into the database. So first we need to import the model into the Express file with const. I'm just going to call this diary entry model and then equals, and we're just going to point to that entry schema file in the local directory. And the model provides us with the ability to create new instances of the diary entry for the database. Therefore, in the post method, we can do const diary entry equals new diary entry model. And within this method, we're going to be passing in a JSON data representation of our diary entry. So I'm just going to open up some curly braces. I'll do date is equal to the request body date, and the entry is equal to the request body entry, just as we've sort of done before. What I'm going to do next is to console log our diary entry object, and this will just help us to see what it looks like. So one thing we notice is that there is a new field, _ID, that has been created and auto-populated for us as a string. And this _ID represents a unique identifier for each entry that we have within our database, and is very similar to the number we generate and assign to each entry, except all that work is being done by Mongoose. We can now save our diary entry model into the MongoDB database. So the first thing we want to do is to create a connection between our application and the MongoDB database. If we head back into MongoDB cluster, we can connect to our database by first selecting connect, followed by connect your application. And this is going to provide us with a service record address, or SRV, which we can use to connect to our node application. So let's just copy that SRV. And if we go into our Express app, we can first import Mongoose. And what we want to do next is run mongoose.connect. And within the connect method, we're going to paste in that string. So we're going to make two updates to the string. So first, after the .NET /, we're able to specify the name of our database that we're going to create. So the database name I want to call this is just diarydb. And then lastly, what we need to do is paste over the password that we have within angle brackets in the address. So for us, that will be building a mean application. Now our Express app will be able to connect to our MongoDB database for persisting data. The connection will return a promise to us. So what we will do is either console log the success or failure of that connection. So if it does succeed, then I'll just have a then block, and I will console log something along the lines of connected. And if we fail to connect to our database, I'll have a catch block, and I will just console log failed to connect. So a reminder here is that if you see a failure, then the reason it might fail to connect to your database is because in MongoDB, we might not have the IP address that you're using from your computer whitelisted. So you might want to make sure that the IP addresses that you're currently using are accessible to MongoDB. So if we head down to our post method, we will call diaryentry.save. And this diary entry is going to have all the information that we require for saving, such as the exact database connection that is required from our JS file. It will contain the authentication details, it will contain the schema that we're persisting into. So what's going to be persisted is the data that we pass, along with that automated ID that is created. So the diary entry will be persisted into a database with the name of diary entries, as MongoDB will use the name of the model key to create the DB table. So as we define that key as diary entry, it will create a collection called diary entries. So after creating the entry, we will verify this outcome by connecting with the MongoDB Shell, which is our only view into the Mongo database as we're using the free tier. So if you're paying for MongoDB, you'll have a nice UI visualization, but otherwise we'll be using the Mongo Shell. So we can download the Mongo Shell into our machine by following the instructions from our MongoDB webpage. Simply select connect as we did before, but then select MongoDB Shell. So into the terminal, we can navigate into the bin folder from our download by calling mongosh, And then what we want to do is copy the string from the MongoDB documents that has been provided to us. And I'm just going to make one small change. So rather than connecting to my first database, what we're going to do is change this name to DiaryDB, as that is the name of the database that we're creating. I'll then enter my password for the database, which is building a mean application, and this will help us to connect. So now let's take a look at some of the commands that we can run for reading our database. So we can run show collections to see the collections that we have within our database, and the collection name, as I mentioned earlier, is the plural of our model name, so that will be diary entries. And then if we run db.diaryentries.find, that is simply like selecting all of the entries from our collection, and we can see all the items printed to us in the terminal. So now we're able to see end-to-end how our application connects with MongoDB and how we're able to actually persist data into MongoDB. So the next step we have here is fetching the data from the database with our application. So if we head to our get method, I'll perform a database search with diaryEntryModel.find, and this method will return all of the entries back to us. Then I will chain this response with .then, which will be executed once all of our data has been returned. I'm just going to pass in that data as the argument, and very simply I will add the response.json method into the then block, passing in that data that we have received from the database to replace the previous diary entries. I'll also add a catch block just for any errors that we're receiving in the data, just to let us know that we're having a problem there. So as we've seen earlier, the response returns us an underscore ID, whereas we have a value of ID in our diary entry model without that underscore. So to help our application match the database, we will transform the response we receive in the diary data service, will be to the diary entries JSON that we receive, and this can now be of type any and not diary entry, because what we receive from MongoDB has the underscore ID, whereas in our diary entry we're expecting that to be ID on its own. So we'll have a problem there if we expect this to be casted to an instance of diary entry. So what I'm going to do is now transform this object of type any into our diary entry, and I'm going to do this by using the pipe method to apply an operator to our response. So I will import the operator from RxJS, and this is called map. And essentially what map does is take all the incoming data, it allows us to then transform it in however way we want, and then we can return that new data to the further part in our pipe. And what we receive is data from MongoDB, and then I'm going to return that same data. We're going to access the diary entries and we're going to map it. What I'm going to do here is just say what type of data that we're receiving. So we're going to have a JSON data where we have the date as a string, the entry as a string, and an underscore ID object as a string as well. So this is what we expect to receive from MongoDB. And then below that I'm just going to return a new JSON object where we have the date, which is equal to the entry.date, where we have an entry, which is equal to the entry.entry, and then where we have a new ID, which is equal to the entry.underscore ID, and that's what we're receiving from MongoDB. And then lastly, what I'm going to do is update the subscribe method, which is below this pipe. So we're going to receive the updated data as an argument, just to make it a little bit more reader friendly, and we're going to reassign the value of this.diary entries to the updated data instead of accessing the JSON data that we received before. So if we want to delete a single item, we need to update our Express middleware to use the delete one method. This method will accept an argument that will match a key and value and simply remove that instance from the database. So I'm going to call diaryEntryModel.deleteOne with an open bracket and a curly brace, and within this curly brace we're going to tell MongoDB, okay, which entry is it that we want to delete and which property is this single entry going to have. So we're going to tell MongoDB, firstly we want to find the underscore ID property of all the entries that we have within our collection, and the database entry that we will want to remove will have an ID which is equal to the request params and then ID. So it's fairly similar, we're still using the ID to delete an entry, however we're using this delete one method to do so. And I would also encourage you to take a look at some of the documentation from MongoDB so you can have a look at how delete one is working, and also some of the further information that we have on how you can delete items from your database. So before I can pass in the ID as we expect it to be passed in, I'll need to correct our application to read in the ID as a string and not a number. So this is kind of a problem that we have from our earlier videos. Perhaps I should have just defined the ID as a string, but it's not too complicated of an update to make, and it just allows us to also work through our application one more time so we can see how everything is working. So for now, I will change the diary entry model to replace the ID as a string, and then there's also some other references within our application. So I'll head to the diary component and also the diary form. So now when we select delete, we will be passing in the ID, which is a string which comes from MongoDB, to the Express middleware, and then the diary entry model will call delete1, passing in the JSON of _ID and the ID we have from our entry. So the final update for us to make is for editing the diary entry, and at the moment our application will mostly work with loading the diary entry into the form. This is because the pre-existing code that we had in the diary form component is still relevant. It will still check for the edit mode, it will still pass in the param ID, which is now that long string, to the diary data service to get the diary entry method that we want. And then this method will return the index of the diary entry with the correct ID. So it's still sort of working in that sense. However, we still have work to do to update the single entry in MongoDB for this to work as we would like it to. So if we head to the put method in our Express file, we will define a new constant called updated entry using the diary entry model. This will use the JSON data that we've already defined from our request body. However, we will just need to change the ID to _ID and to create a new instance of our diary entry model within brackets. Now we have our updated entry, we will be able to use the update1 method from our diary entry model, and again this has been taken from the MongoDB documentation, and this will specify which entry in our database to update. So we're going to pass in two arguments here. So first we want to tell MongoDB which item is it that we're going to be updating, and we're going to have an identifier for this. So within curly braces, I'll pass in the key of _ID. So it's going to be looking for the _ID property and the value of the request params ID. So now MongoDB knows, okay, we're looking for the ID of this value to be updated. And what are we going to be updating it with? So we're just going to be passing in the updated entry object as the second argument. So now MongoDB knows what to update it with. I'm just going to close off this request with a then block, where the response of status 200 and a JSON response message is going to be returned just as we had before. So let's head back into our application to see it working. And that's it. Our entire full stack main application is now working. Let's do some cleaning up in our code for redundant methods such as the diary entries array in the Express file, and the maxID method and the maxID HTTP call made in the diary data service. And that's actually it. So thank you so much for watching through the series, and well done on creating a complete application with MongoDB, Angular, Express and Node. There is still a lot of work that this application can do, from handling exceptions, adding meaningful error responses, and so much more. There's so much great documentation with MongoDB that I would encourage you to check out, but I am also going to publish some future videos on how you can do all of this.